I'm Ellen Hanak. I'm an economist with the Public Policy Institute of California, and I lead our work on water. Fortunately, I get a lot of help, and you're going to get to meet some of the folks from the current project in a minute. So let's see. I want to start, though, by, well, first thanking you for being here, and secondly for thanking the funders of this work from the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation and the California Water Foundation. And somewhere around the room you'll find folks from both of those shops. I want to thank the panelists, some of whom have come across town and some of whom who have traveled far. I think the furthest, I don't know whether is Seattle or San Diego furthest, I'm not sure. So thanks very much for that. And also to the many folks who helped us with this research, who either through sort of small discussions that we had while we were doing it, or by helping us to review the draft. I also want to tell you, in your packet, you've got, in addition to the agenda and the bios, you've got the main report that we're going to be talking about today. We had aimed initially for that to be about 25 pages long, and it turned out to be about 80, and we were like really, trying to keep it compact, and there are about 180 pages of appendices. So if you really want to dig into the details, you can go to our website and find that. There are also a couple data sets on there that might be useful in terms of looking at bond spending and local elections. So before I get into sort of introducing the team and talking about giving you an overview, let me just, let's see, ask you to please silence your cell phones, if you can. Some key logistical issues: restrooms right outside the door, so that's easy. In terms of the schedule for today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the study, and then we're going to go right into the first panel. Then we're going to have a break. There's still going to be food available and coffee and tea at the time of the break. And then we're going to come back for a couple more panels. And then at 1 o'clock, we're going to break for lunch. And that's going to be the informal discussion time. So just kind of feel free to move around and grab anybody you want to talk to about things and enjoy some lunch. And let's see. For those of you joining us via the webcast, hello. If you would like to ask questions, you can do so via Twitter, and the hashtag is #PayForWater, and the 4 is a little number 4. This is an experiment for us, and I am not on Twitter, so I'm getting help with Katrin, who will be able to tell us when Twitter questions come in. And I think that's all I've got in terms of logistics, so maybe we can move into the overview presentation, and I'm going to start by introducing the rest of the team. Here they are up in photos, and those of you who are actually here, of the authors, if you could just stand up for a second, just so people can find you and come and complain to you later. So we have about half of us here today, but as you can see, it's a large group, and this time we got some ladies in on the team. So that was really good. So it was really terrific for this team to be able to work with so many folks in the water management area. And maybe just start by kind of getting a sense of the audience here. So how many of you work on water supply? All right, that's pretty good. I don't know, maybe about a quarter. How many of you work on wastewater? All right, maybe, I don't know, 6th. How many of you work on stormwater? Oh, pretty good. All right. How many work on floods? A lot. How many work on ecosystem management? Well, so, we're getting a pretty good distribution here. And how many work on integrating water management? Everyone, right? Great. So when we talk about paying for water, we're really looking at that whole broad spectrum of things, and that's just important to keep in mind, especially as we think about the drought now, and so much of the focus is on water supply. That was not the drought was not the reason we did this study. We started this back in the summer, but we do think that the drought highlights the essential role of funding in supporting our water system, and I'm going to give you a couple examples of that as I go through some of our findings. And really, that managing water, it's not just about supply for the drought, it's about how you can manage it in a more integrated way in order to get benefits for water supply reliability and other things. So, overview of what I'm going to talk to you about today. First, a little bit about current water funding sources. Then I'm going to move into a brief discussion of some of the legal constraints on funding, especially at the local level. Then a report card, fiscal report card, and then a roadmap of our recommendations for funding reform. So here, let's start with bonds. We're in Sacramento right now. I don't know, at the last count, there were 9 or maybe 10 different bill proposals in the legislature for a bond. Right now, we have a bond scheduled for the November 2014 ballot, but that has been postponed a couple times already. And there's been a lot of work in the legislature really ever since last summer to try to put together an alternative proposal that might be smaller, might have some different components. This just shows you, in a brief overview way, how important bonds have been in the recent past compared to decades prior to that. Now, these are all in real dollars, in 2012 dollars, so that we can kind of compare apples to apples here with the earlier years. And you can see that the amount of money passed by voters in the 2000s was just way higher than in the earlier decades. That's, in nominal terms, it's almost 20 billion that was passed. A couple in 2000, 2002, and 2006. You can see there that if we get a bond in November 2014, we're still looking at way less this decade of new money than we have gotten in the last decade. And just to sort of see what that's meant over time in terms of water funding available from the bonds, this graph breaks it out starting in 2000. The solid line is all the money spent from those bonds, and the dotted blue line is the money that's really gone toward the water sector. And that's because some of these bonds also had a substantial amount of money for parks and things that are not especially water related. I want to also point out to you that orange line, which shows you the repayment schedule for this money, which gets paid back through the general fund. That's the way the bonds were written. And you can see that as of last year, those two lines crossed. So now we're at the point where we're repaying as much or more than we're actually getting out in new money for the water sector. And that's kind of an important thing to think about going forward. The fact that we had this bond money, which has been very valuable to a lot of folks, a lot of programs, there is a payday due, and that's going to be part of the issue in terms of thinking about options for the future. So we get about $1 billion a year in bond money for the water sector. Here's an audience quiz, just to see if your caffeine is kicking in. What would you say? How much, what share, what percentage of all water system funding comes from bonds in California in a given year, assuming it's about $1 billion a year? 1%. 1%? 2%? All right, you guys are pretty good. It's 3% about. So it's not a lot. And if you think about how much of the focus and energy in the discussions about water funding goes toward bonds relative to that small percentage, it's important to keep in mind. And again, not to say that bonds are not valuable, but it's a small piece of the puzzle. So here is the total picture for how much is spent on the water system. And we've broken it down in a couple of ways. One is looking across the different functions. And integrated water management tries to bring a lot of these together, but the way the accounting goes, usually you have to actually look at them separately because the management often tends to be by agencies that have a primary function. So we've got water supply, water quality, that includes both wastewater and a little bit for stormwater, probably about $500 million a year for stormwater, flood management, aquatic ecosystems, and then I put in there the geodebt service because that really should be considered as part of what we spend on water. And you can see the color coding and it highlights for you the differences of where the money comes from. 85%, the orange, comes from the locals. It means local rates, local fees, local taxes that are collected by local and regional agencies to pay for the system. State spending, including the bonds and including some other sources, including general fund and some fees for particular types of regulatory actions, we're looking at 11%. Federal dollars, tiny, 4%. And that's clearly important in some areas. In flood management, it's a larger share, but it's really small, and it's probably going to be declining just given the fiscal difficulties that we face in Washington, D.C. And therefore, anybody who can get federal money for their projects, more power to you, but we cannot be thinking about the federal government as the way to get out of our spending problems in water. We have to be thinking about how we're going to do this in California. Okay, now on to a quick overview of some legal constraints. And we especially focused on the issues for local governments here because locals are such an important part of the picture. It's relevant also to some extent for state funding. And we provide a detailed analysis of this in the report that looks particularly at 3 fiscal reform measures that came in starting in the late 70s. The first of those is the landmark Prop 13, which was important for locals in the sense that it restricted property tax revenues, which used to be kind of the easy go-to place for infrastructure. So that meant local agencies had to shift, and that's fine. There are other ways to do that besides property taxes. It did something also, though, that was important and has turned out to be especially meaningful for a meaningful constraint for certain kinds of water sector activities. It created a new category of taxes called special taxes, and it stipulated that those had to be passed by 2/3 of voters rather than 50%, which is what local general taxes require, or which is what any statewide fiscal ballot measure requires. Then comes Prop 218. Prop 218 from 1996, this was specifically focused at local government fundraising, and it did a couple of things. One is that it further kind of tightened the definition of what kind of taxes could be levied by local governments in that special districts, which are very important in the water sector, cannot by definition levy a general tax. So if they want to go to voters with a tax measure, it's got to be a special tax for 2/3. And then Prop 218 did a whole slew of things related to what are called property-related fees and assessments. And these are really in the spirit of accountability, improving accountability and transparency of how local governments raise their funding. And we think that there are a lot of really valuable aspects to this reform, but also some probably unintended consequences in terms of how water gets managed. So I'll just run through quickly for you. So the first bullet, the first thing that Prop 218 did is that, and this is an accountability measure, it required noticing any time that there is a change in rates or new rates, that you get a note in the mail if there's going to be a change in your rates on anything, trash, water, or wastewater. It also gave the opportunity for a protest hearing, which means that so people get the notice, there's a protest hearing date set, and people have the opportunity to either come in person or to write in and object. By law, if half of all people object, then the agency has to go back to the drawing board. In fact, what we found is that you don't need 50% of the people to object for the boards to rethink things. So it seems like it's a useful mechanism in terms of getting public feedback. Second, it introduced some substantive, Prop 218 introduced some substantive requirements about what is legitimately a fee, and that relates to how you charge a property relative to the costs of service to that property. So one aspect of it is that it has to be, whatever you get charged in terms of fees have to be proportional to the cost of service to your property. And then a second piece of it is that it has to be, you can only be charged for services delivered to your property. Now this has turned out to be complicated in ways that we think are probably unintended with respect to water, and I'll give you a couple examples. One is in a number of places, tiered water rates have come under challenge on the idea, these are rates where you pay a higher price per gallon for higher amounts of water use, and on questions as to whether or not that is precisely linked to the cost of service. We know in general that will reduce, that'll induce water conservation and reduce use, and that new sources of water are more costly. So there is a broad relationship like that, but it turns out that it can be hard to make that very precise link. So that's tricky. And then this idea of having to only charge for services that are delivered to the property, in some cases courts have interpreted that very narrowly to think that it has to be the drop of water that has to be delivered to your property. And so there's one case in Orange County right now where the trial court ruled that recycled water could not be, the cost of recycled water could not be charged to everybody in the service area. You know, it's very rare that recycled water will actually be delivered to every property just because it's not practical to do that. But the costs can be shared. If you think about water system reliability, you would want the cost to be shared overall because that makes other sources more available and to the rest of the system. Well, this court ruled based on the plaintiff's charge that they weren't getting some of that water and therefore they shouldn't have to pay for it. This is now in appeal. So those things are important for water and wastewater. Now for flood management and for stormwater pollution management, it turns out that there is an additional restriction in Prop 218 which has proven to make it very hard to raise money, and that is that in addition to going through the protest hearing process and having the cost of service requirements, they also have to actively get the people paying the fee to vote for it, either half of the property owners or 2/3 of the general public in the area. And somehow that just getting the active vote is just a higher hurdle than letting people know and not having a majority protest. I don't know, you know, probably there's the social psychologists will have to help us with what the difference is there. But it's been very hard for these agencies to raise money. And then Prop 26, just to wrap up on these reforms, this was the latest one. This one addresses really fees that are not property related, you know, mainly think about regulatory fees for various kinds of government services. There's a lot of uncertainty still about exactly what this does. We're quite sure that it no longer allows you to put a fee on someone to mitigate legacy effects, you know, things that have already happened before. We think that it does still allow you to put a fee in order to mitigate forward-looking effects. For example, if you're, you have an industry that is emitting a lot of, responsible for a lot of trash, putting a fee on trash, on those products so that it can help with the cleanup of that trash, we think that is probably okay. We think it is okay, but that's probably going to have to withstand litigation. And then this Prop 26 also likely brings wholesale water agencies under the fold in terms of the cost of service requirements that you have with Prop 218. They have considered themselves exempt from 218 because they don't actually deliver to properties, they just deliver to other retail agencies. And there's a case now in Southern California that is where the trial court basically ruled that this is true, or that it does apply. Okay, fiscal report card. I'm going to start with good news. And this is surprising good news for a lot of people because of what you hear in the press. You tend to hear that this is not true. We find that the urban water and wastewater utilities are in relatively good fiscal health. And we measure this, you know, in a couple of ways. One is seeing are they meeting their service requirements? You know, on the water supply side, are they basically providing water service that's reliable enough to support the economy? Are they delivering clean water and safe water? On the wastewater side, are they cleaning the water up well enough before it gets discharged back into rivers and lakes and the ocean? Generally, the answer is yes, with a few exceptions in small systems that I'll get to in a minute. We also measure this by looking at an estimate of capital needs for these functions and comparing that with what's actually being spent on investments. And that's what this graph shows you. So the orange bars, those are capital needs estimates, and that's developed every 4 years by the US EPA, pulling together information from the field, from the local water and wastewater utilities, and then they make adjustments for missing data and so on. And so this is just dividing that up, because these are 20-year estimates, so we just divided up the 20-year needs into 20. And so if there was even spending of that money over all 20 years, this is what you'd need to be spending. In water, $2.3 billion a year, and in wastewater, $1.4 billion. And relative to that, you see the capital spending is higher. And we would say that's a good thing, because there are some things that these needs estimates probably don't account for, like some of the seismic retrofits that are needed, allowing for population growth in some areas and so on. And probably also some of these agencies are front-loading some of that 20-year spending, and that's also a good thing. It means they're getting it done sooner than later. So this is good. Now, we think that this is actually, in this drought, a sign that we've improved our drought resilience, and that's also a really important aspect to having adequate funding. There are looming concerns. One is that costs are rising. Costs in the urban sector have been rising by faster than the cost of inflation for a variety of reasons. And also there are these looming legal obstacles related to Prop 218, including the ones that I mentioned, and the fact that Prop 218 doesn't really allow for lifeline rates as we traditionally think of them, where people are just cross-subsidizing the lower income households. So here's the report card for the rest. Mostly failing. Pretty much everything else, except for water and wastewater in the urban sector, are failing. This gives you, the column there and the annual gap gives you our estimate of how much money a year we ought to be spending that we're not, just to meet today's service requirements and regulatory requirements. And we have one that's on the brink. So we have, failing safe drinking water in small rural systems, flood protection, stormwater, aquatic ecosystem management, especially thinking about recovery efforts. And then integrated management is on the brink, and that's because it's really been propped up mainly by bond funding. And so there are big questions about what happens if we don't get more bond money for that. All told, $2 to $3 billion a year that we should be spending relative to what we're spending now. It's not a huge gap. You remember I showed you 30 billion plus that we're spending totally for the system. So it's an additional 7 to 10%. It's not huge, but it's going to be hard to fill without some changes. And I want to run through really quickly this report card. You're going to hear more about this in the first panel. This just shows you the problems of where we have small systems that have contaminated groundwater. And these are concentrated in a couple of agricultural areas. In particular, there's been a lot of news about that with nitrate in the Tulare Basin and Salinas Valley, but you actually have these systems all over the state. This is now on the radar. There's been a lot of policy attention to this and some legislation that should help with that. This is really an affordability issue. It's not a Prop 218 problem. It's just that these are low-income households, and it's very expensive per household to fix this problem. And we have some suggestions for how to do that by improving access and also raising some funds for that. Floods, big gap. This is using a recent study from DWR and the Army Corps of Engineers. We did the same thing, looking at the capital spending relative to capital needs, and you can see it's quite the opposite picture from water and wastewater. So the orange here is the need, and that's taking the lowball need from the Army Corps and DWR's study. So it's assuming $34 billion total. We said, okay, that should be reasonably done in 25 years if we want to be reasonable about meeting our flood protection needs. So that's just 1/25 of that, 1.4 billion. And what we're spending on capital is just a little bit over 600 million a year. And a big chunk of that's from bond funds that are running out. So if we continue at the pace we're at without new bond funds, it would take us 75 years to get to that spending level. So it's a big challenge for us. And part of the challenge here is that there's been an expectation that the feds would come in with a big cost share. And they haven't been able to do that to nearly the extent that is needed. And so it really suggests a need for California to think about what combination of state and local funding should come into this instead. Stormwater is the area that's been most hard hit by the constitutional reforms that I mentioned to you, and that's because this is a job that has changed fundamentally after Prop 218 came in. Because stormwater management used to just be about draining the streets so that people didn't have to drive through a foot of water. Now it's about pollution management, and there are increasingly strict requirements on trying to clean up things, including trash, but also bacteria and various kinds of chemicals, so that for public health and safety, as well as for healthy watersheds, environmental health. And these guys basically have to go every time they want more money. They either have to beg the city government. This is usually mostly cities and counties that are responsible for this. They have to look for general coffer money from the city government, or they have to go and get voter approval. And we have data on that. It's pretty hard to do this. The only communities that have successfully done it are coastal communities where this stuff is right up on their beach. And so they have a much stronger motivation than the folks who are upstream, but who are actually also causing that problem. Habitat and aquatic recovery efforts. There's been a lot of attention to this. Any new project that gets done puts a lot of money into environmental mitigation. We figure of the investments that are done, anywhere between 3 to 10% goes to different kinds of environmental mitigation. But there's a big question about what do you do about the legacy impacts and sort of the delta is a good example of that. We know that there's a lot of effort needed to restore that ecosystem to health, and questions about who should pay for it. Should it be the general taxpayers, or should it be the folks who are benefiting from the use of the resources that benefited from some investment decisions made a long time ago when the environmental laws were different? And then integration, and here's a beautiful example. You're going to have a discussion of this, I think, in the next panel. This is from Burlingame. It's an example of a green street. It's low impact development. It's a way to capture stormwater. It can also recharge the groundwater basin. It's integrated with a new complete streets, making the place more walkable and livable. It's an example of how you have to work together between water supply, stormwater, and in this case actually transportation management. There's been a lot of improvement in thinking about water as an integrated system, but we still have a ways to go. And the idea is breaking down the silos and getting the folks from different agencies and different responsibilities to work together. The state has put a lot of money into this with bond funds, and the idea has been to jumpstart collaborations, which, if you're not used to working together, it can be helpful. And also to provide sort of scientific and technical support to that. It's turning out to be, everybody we talk to among the local managers like the idea and could give us good examples of where they've benefited from integration, but it's hard for some partners to be involved if they can't put money into the till, and that's especially an issue for stormwater agencies. And then now roadmap for funding reform. Just wrap this up quickly for you. Where did the bonds go? Turns out, this is a graph showing you the water-focused money from the bonds passed since 2000 mostly went to these gap areas. We had not expected this necessarily. So, it suggests that the folks that were crafting those bonds already had a good sense of where there really were gaps that needed a boost, and that's a great thing. I think there are questions about how much of the new bonds are going to keep going into these areas, and there's a lot of discussion about putting more money into supply rather than some of these areas. So I think it's going to be important to think about where can one raise funds locally, and where do we really need bonds to fill a gap that needs to be that discussion needs to be had. We definitely heard feedback about room for improvement in how the money is spent. I won't go into that now. We give some examples in the report, and maybe that'll come up in the panels. So what we do say is that, we've seen bonds have been putting in at most $1 billion a year. The gap that we identified is $2 to $3 billion a year. So at most, the bonds can fill half, maybe a third, if they're directed in these areas, which means we just don't have a choice but to go for a broader mix. And so we opt for a very broad mix in our recommendations. And this kind of summarizes for you the various different kinds of sources of money that would be that would make sense. So some taxes, sort of things that are not directly connected to the activity that's being funded, and that can be local general fund, state general fund, some broad special taxes, say a sales tax increment, a parcel tax. Some things could be connected to the activity being funded, and that could sometimes mean it would be a fee rather than a tax. Water use surcharge, chemical surcharge to handle pollution issues, a road use surcharge, that's an important source of stormwater pollution, is road use, hydropower surcharge, potentially to help with some ecosystem things. And then, some have to have a very close connection to the activity being funded, property assessments and fees and developer fees. Those are already widely used at the local level. Now, I don't know if you can see the colors well. Some of these have an orange check. Those are the ones that are not used at all, or that are only used sometimes and at the local level, and we're suggesting that there's a need to use them more broadly and really kind of try to as much as possible connect the sources of funding to the activities that are being supported. If you go with a broad mix, you're talking about small amounts of money for any particular surcharge. So recommendations, and we have them for all kinds of different folks. This is starting with the locals. We think that they can make a better case. It's very important, the transparency and accountability that these fiscal reforms that Californians approved, that's helped a lot, I think, in terms of getting agencies to make a better case. They can still do better at that, making a better case about explaining to the public why they need to raise funds and for what purpose. communication of the costs and the needs. The other thing that we found is that integration is really valuable, and this is both across agencies but also within agencies. The agencies that can do better at the local level at raising funds often have multiple mandates. And I can give you one example from Santa Clara Valley Water District. I think Joan Mayer is here from there. That's an agency that at the county level has water supply, surface water supply, groundwater management, flood management, and watershed protection. They've got this broad mandate, and that has enabled them to go to their voters and get special taxes approved, special parcel taxes approved, that cover a package of things. And what we found when we looked at local measures and which ones were successful and which ones were not, the ones that were much more successful tended to be measures that were not single purpose. They were kind of a package, a little bit like the special taxes that people often pass for transportation. Those include a package of projects that will appeal to a variety of voters. So integrated functions can help with that. And that may mean needing to make have regional measures with a combination of agencies when there's not, all one mandate in one agency. State and federal agencies are going to really need to help reduce costs, especially in the areas of stormwater management and in just basically improving regulatory efficiency for how people get permits for doing things, even sometimes things that are just designed to be helpful for the environment. It's very costly and a major headache, and that money could be used better if it were directed in a more efficient way. And then the state and federal agencies can help crunching the numbers to help locals know what is going to work. Legislation can help in ways beyond getting a different bond on the ballot in November. So we really think that there's a whole package of things that the legislature should do. One of it is passing new taxes and fees at the state level. We have special taxes at the state level now for transportation and for education. We don't have anything like that for water. It would be useful to have a reliable source of funding for some of these things. And one option is a water use surcharge. Could also be a sales tax increment, a surcharge on chemicals to help fund nitrate pollution and so on. A lot of different options for that. Second thing is, and this is not costly in any fiscal way for the state, extending funding authorities at the local level to make it possible for local agencies to raise funds. And this means, sort of thinking about where we have pilot projects in California effectively. In our water code, we allow certain special agencies to do some things that are not available to all of the agencies. An example is the Irvine Ranch Water District. In the water code, they and one other water district have the authority to use the upper tier water revenues, from people that are really using a lot of water outdoors in the summer. They can use that to help capture and treat the runoff from that, what they call urban slobber down in Southern California. And so that's keeping Newport Bay cleaner, and there's a tight nexus there because that water is being used. It's overwatering, and it's a way of sort of using that to help convince people to use less water and also clean up the pollution. That's the kind of thing you want to extend to make it available more generally so that other agencies can do that. Third thing is encouraging the consolidation of small systems in rural areas that are not being able to provide safe drinking water. This can be both other agencies that are near them physically or just other agencies that could take over administratively and run those. But right now there's a constraint, which is that the fear of liability for taking over a system that has contamination. So we think this is where the state could step in, take on that liability. Obviously there has to be a timeline for the new agency to take over and clean it up, but that could be a way of making these more durably sustainable. And then the fourth is guiding the courts on the interpretation of water management costs. Sort of the legislature can't rewrite the Constitution, but it can give the courts a sense that it really does consider that some of these integrated things, like including recycled wastewater in your water system, is part of water supply reliability, and that we shouldn't go with molecular accounting of that. Now we also, and this is going to be the topic of the last panel, we also do recommend some constitutional reforms because we think that there's so much uncertainty on some of these issues that it kind of just depends on your luck of the draw with the court that you get. And we also think that there's a value in changing some of the voting rules on some of these things. So one would be just some sort of think about it as a package of reforms for integrated water management. One is making it clear that portfolio-based water pricing is good. It has to be accountable, it has to be transparent, but that you don't need to do molecular counting. The second is treating stormwater as a regulatory fee and not as a property-related fee. So really just treating it not as something that, more as something that you have to mitigate in the same way of other kinds of environmental consequences that are done. And that would mean also not having to have an active vote by the public. You need accountability and transparency, but not an active vote. Floods, we're saying treat them like water and sewer. So not requiring the active vote, but still under Prop 218, all of the transparency that's required. 4 is allowing lifeline rates. This is something that's done with private water and energy, and people are fine with it. We think it's going to be important going forward given that costs are rising. And then the 5th is lowering the voter threshold for special taxes back to 50%, which is where local general taxes are and where statewide ballot measures for, on fiscal measures are. And so here's the last quiz, and we're just about done. How many of the 6 bonds that voters passed in the 2000s would have passed if we were operating at the 2/3 local voter requirement? Who said none? Okay. Yep, none. All right. You want to see? None. And in fact, almost none of any of the measures that went before voters since the 70s would have passed in that way. Now, obviously, if we'd had that requirement, those bonds probably wouldn't have been on the ballot in the first place because it costs money to have a campaign and so on. But it just shows you the difficulty that locals face relative to the state. And it's not surprising that we've gone to state bonds as a way of filling these gaps, given that that's somewhat easier. So we think that the drought opens the window for reform. This is from the latest PPIC survey compared with the last couple of years. An open-ended question where Californians are asked to say what they think the biggest problem is. It's a top issue facing the state. The economy is almost always up there at the top. You can see that, well, you know, the economy is doing somewhat better now, so maybe that's partly accounting for why that's only down to 32% now. But I think a big part of it is that people really have water on their radar. We found that 9 out of 10 Californians' households were reducing water use because of the drought. It's on people's minds. This is a good window to do things besides put a new bond on the ballot. And I'm just going to wrap up here by saying that we can do this. And we're looking at $12 to $20 per household a month to fill these critical gaps. It's not a lot. Strong leaders are needed both at the local and state level to make the case. And I'm going to end by saying thank you. I don't know if I have any time for questions. I probably run over. 1 or 2? Okay, great. 1 or 2 questions. 1 or 2. Yes? Wait, the mic. Wait, we want to get you on mic.
Where?
No, I don't want to get on mic. You don't want to get on mic?
Thank you. I can project.
No,
actually,
the web audience, please.
Oh, dear. My question is, in California, if you're familiar with water issues, why do we ever get taken out of being declared a drought? Ever?
So, right, and I guess, you know, what I'll say is I think there's a difference between the extraordinary things that need to be done in a year like this, which is, it hasn't been this dry since the late 70s, and there's a difference between sort of getting people on a path of constantly improving water management and getting better at conservation and efficiency and so on, and some of the extraordinary things that need to be done in a drought. And you know, there's a danger of crying wolf, I think, too. So it's a balance to be struck, and maybe we're not completely at that balance yet, and maybe in some places we need to be doing better at the long-term messaging. But thank you. Okay, from the Twitter sphere, right?
Okay, so from our online audience, the question is, are there ways we can more effectively spend the billions of dollars that are already being spent on water?
Thank you for that question. Yes. And I think, you know what, rather than elaborate, I'm going to turn it over because I think that our panels are going to be able to help answer that much more fully and with vibrant detail. So I'm going to hand it over now to our first panel, which is going to look a little bit more at the orphan areas that I highlighted for you there. Jay Lund, one of the authors of the report, is going to moderate for you, and you want to introduce your panel, Jay? Thank you.